Hi, my name is Katie Torson, and I'm a counselor here at Open Doors for Lanark Children and Youth. And today I'm going to be talking to you about self injury, or as it's more commonly known, self harm. I know that this can be an uncomfortable and distressing topic, and please know that this video will not contain any imagery or descriptions of self injury. The purpose of this video is to provide strategies and tips to those with a child, a friend, or a loved one who's struggling with self injury. When you discover that someone you love is self injuring, you may understandably become anxious and fearful for that person's safety. Oftentimes, you might feel upset or helpless, and sometimes your concern and fear can actually turn into anger. I hope that this video provides you with some insight into how you can approach such a difficult topic with someone, including the things that you should avoid doing or saying. Helping someone who self injures can be really difficult, and parents, friends, and loved ones often put a lot of pressure on themselves to do everything exactly right to avoid failing. That kind of pressure isn't helpful for you and them, and it's just going to cause you stress if you actually end up feeling like you are failing. And it's also potentially going to create that same feeling in the self injurer. They might start to feel upset that they have failed you as well. Those who self injure often experience a lot of shame and guilt, both related to the self injury itself and to other things going on in their lives. The urge to hide and avoid seeking help when they feel ashamed of something, whether that's something that they've done, an act like self injury, or the feelings or emotions that have led them to that point, is usually what leads to coping strategies like self injury. They're trying to deal with and regulate their emotional pain in private. And if they end up feeling shame about the self injury itself, then they're just going to try to hide that too. Some self injurers immediately feel guilt about what they're doing, and others will only come to experience or feel guilt once they've had a certain response from others, whether that's, again, about the self injury or even just a negative response to the emotions that usually they are trying to regulate with self injury. So, for example, if someone has a strong emotional reaction, that's going to make them feel guilty and they're going to try to move even further into hiding what they've done and they're going to close off to you even more. The cycle of shame and guilt that a self injurer feels is reinforced for them when stopping the behavior, stopping them from self injuring, is triumphed over helping them to address the feelings that led them to cope that way in the first place. Self injurers also often struggle to explain what they're thinking or feeling, which is made worse by the experience of shame and guilt. For many, self injury is the only way that they know how to communicate, whether to others or just to themselves. Those who don't make an attempt to hide their self injury are not just seeking attention or crying out for attention in the negative way that we've associated with that term. They're using their own language to say that they are struggling with an overwhelming emotion because they don't know how to put that into words. It may also feel like a form of protection for some of them, so they might think that having visible self injury keeps certain kinds of people away from them or prevents them from being unkind to them. Those who do hide their self injury often don't want to let on to the fact that they are struggling in their suffering, whether that's because they believe that there's a certain set of expectations on them, so they might be perfectionists, for example, or because they just appear strong and they want to keep that image up. They want to look like they are strong to protect themselves from others because vulnerability to them might feel like a weakness or a risk. So for them, self injury is the only way that they allow themselves to release emotional pain and to express it, even if that is not something that other people can see, even if it's just expressing it for themselves, to themselves. So you might be asking yourself, well, what do I do when I know that someone is self injuring? What do I do with this information? And I'm going to break it down into a few different parts.
So, if you're planning on having a conversation with someone about self injury, one of the first things that is helpful to do is to identify what you are bringing into things. You're likely really anxious and fearful for this person that you care about, and that makes a lot of sense. This might apply as well to when you are the friend of someone who is self injuring or another loved one, but especially when you're a parent or caregiver, your instinct is usually to protect the child from whatever's hurt them. So when you find out that they are the one who hurt themselves, it can get really confusing. And you may actually end up feeling angry at them because you're trying to figure out what to do with all of those panicked, worried, defensive feelings you would usually aim at the person who has hurt your child. When you don't know what to do with those feelings and they build up and it's a really intense and scary situation, anger can be what comes out first. Noticing that and checking that and recognizing that that may be a feeling that you have to contend with before you have a conversation can be really helpful in making sure that you're not creating even more guilt and shame for that person. And speaking of guilt and shame, that is another thing that it's really helpful to identify in yourself before you go into a conversation with someone who is self injuring. So you can't help someone with their cycle of guilt and shame if you put yourself in your own cycle by feeling guilt about not knowing how to help or feeling shame about things you've already done that may have been more harmful than helpful. If you're not aware that you're in a cycle of shame or guilt, or you're not acknowledging that, you might find yourself responding or continuing to respond in ways that don't feel the most helpful because you're likely to use a shield against those feelings of guilt and shame because we don't want to feel those. They're not pleasant things to have to sit with. So you may end up finding yourself doing some blaming, minimizing, raging at the person who's self injuring, and that's just going to push them further into their own cycle and further away from being able to openly communicate with you. And that's not what you want in a situation like that. So, being aware of where and how your own guilt and shame are coming up is really important. And then doing whatever you need to do to manage those feelings so that you can be there for your loved one. The second helpful thing to keep in mind is being kind and understanding with yourself. It is okay to feel overwhelmed and to have moments where you say or do the wrong thing. What's important is to let the person know that you are committed to being there for them and helping them to address whatever root problem has led them to using self injury to cope. And reminding them that you're still processing this alongside them and you may have your off days. Remember that being open and honest about your own thoughts and feelings is really helpful modeling, especially since self injurers often struggle with expressing their own thoughts or feelings out loud, as we said before. The third thing to acknowledge are your barriers and the things that maybe are making it so that you cannot be as fully present or helpful as you would like to be. This can be something like your attachment history with your parents or caregivers, especially if you are the parent or caregiver in the situation, or any preconceived notions that you may have about self injury. For parents and caregivers and acknowledging their attachment history, the way that this can come into play is either you recognize that you had an insecure attachment to your parents and caregivers and you are trying to overcompensate one way or another, or you're not noticing at all how those insecure attachments are affecting you and you are actually replicating your parent styles with your children. For the overcompensation, that could be that you are handling this in a way that's very strict. So, for example, you are punishing your child for their self injury either by not letting them go out anymore, feeling like you need to keep a really close eye on them, taking away the self injury tools that they are using, but not in a way that feels like, a conversation about their safety. Again, more that feels like a punishment. You have done this, you've done something wrong, so now we have to do this. Or it could be being too lenient, so too accepting of it, or not addressing it at all, thinking it's none of my business. And often, when we see the leniency or the not wanting to address it, that's coming from a place of not wanting to hurt feelings or feeling insecure around how to approach it. If you're forcing yourself to be ready and willing to be there for them in a way that you can't be yet, that will ultimately be more harmful than helpful. If you're finding that you're really triggered or entering fight or flight mode whenever you see a fresh injury, then that might be a time when you say, okay, I don't think I can be the person to be helpful right now. And you might want to tag team with someone else, like your partner or spouse or another person that the self injurer trusts. It's okay to need time to process before you can address things with this person in a helpful and healthy way. And that's really important to keep in mind. It's not selfish if you think, I can't quite be there yet. I want to be there for them, but there's stuff in the way. It's a lot more helpful to acknowledge that that's there and to even let them know that, not in a way that creates shame or guilt, not saying, you're so messed up that I can't handle this, just to say, I really want to be helpful for you. And I find that I'm still struggling with some stuff. So I'm going to try to address that. And in the meantime, I think maybe you should talk to so and so. And lastly, of course, preconceived notions. Be honest with yourself and figure out what you need to do in order to deal with these things. Whether this is, again, that idea of people who self injure are just doing it for attention or as a cry for help, or if you find yourself automatically jumping to the idea that they are suicidal and they're going to do something to themselves, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But anything that is just something that you've heard or an idea that you have that maybe isn't related at all to what the individual who you love is going through, addressing those things and being sure that you have dealt with them and managed them, and that you're not bringing them into things with this person while you are trying to help them. So, a lot of the things that I've already talked about are really helpful for making sure that this fourth point is something that you find possible, and that is to avoid problematic reactions. This is where regulating your own emotions, addressing preconceived notions, all that kind of stuff will be really, really helpful, because problematic reactions, again, are often not ones that we intend to have. They sometimes can just be automatic or knee jerk responses. But if we're not aware of why these kinds of thoughts and feelings are happening in us and we can't address them, they're a lot harder to avoid. Here's what I mean when I say problematic reactions: dismissing the self injury as attention seeking or manipulative behavior, trying to get them to stop by just making them feel bad. So things like ultimatums, trying to use rewards or punishments, or trying to manipulate them via an emotional response. Extreme reactions, including things like anger, so lecturing them, disgust, recoiling from them, or assuming that they are suicidal and placing them on suicide watch. Really, really important to note that self injury does not necessarily point to suicidal intent. Yes, there can be risk factors, such as the length of time that they've been self injuring and the severity of how they are doing so, because often what that tells us is that the problem or the emotion that they're trying to regulate, they are not having very much success in regulating it. So they may get more and more desperate to use more aggressive or intense means, or they may start to feel a certain hopelessness or helplessness themselves. However, just because somebody is self injuring does not mean that they have intent for suicide. That's a really important one to keep in mind. And that's something that you would figure out by talking to them. Another problematic reaction would be regularly searching their room for tools or things that they might be using for self injury. When you're trying to create and foster trust, doing something like going into their space and tearing through their things and trying to find something is not a great way to demonstrate that you're working on trust. And it's also a way that might make them just shut down and not want to talk to you, because they might feel like, well, it doesn't matter what I say, they're going to continue to not listen to what I'm telling them, and they're going to continue to search my room. Again, this is something that a dialogue and an open conversation will be helpful in ensuring that you don't have to do. And it's a lot more effective to do something like creating a safety plan together. Or with a counselor or therapist, being able to figure out, okay, what do we need to take away, especially if there is suicidal thoughts? What do we need to make sure we're taking away and not giving them access to, and that kind of thing. But also, there have been times when somebody is self-injuring and they are doing it in a way that's safe, and it is something that they really need to cope. And so part of a safety plan with a parent or caregiver is in first aid, and making sure that everything is staying clean, everything is staying safe, and that they know that they have someone they can go to if they've ended up having to self-injure, to say, hey, can you help me take care of myself right now? Treating self-injurers like anything you do or say will set them off is either going to give you one of two reactions. It's either going to anger them. They might think, I'm not a child, or especially if you are not the parent or caregiver, but just a friend or a loved one, they might say, you're not my parent, so butt out. Or it's going to make them feel really hopeless. They might think, oh gosh, I shouldn't have said anything. Now I'm never going to have freedom again. Assuming that every word or action may trigger a response from them is not good, because if you feel that you're tiptoeing around, you may just start to harbor resentment and end up having a big blow up or confrontation with this person, which will just trigger their guilt and shame and actually create the thing that you were the most concerned about. And the fifth thing is to focus on connection. If this person has been having difficulty expressing themselves and they're suffering in silence, one of the most helpful and meaningful things that you can do is focus on your connection. Parents and caregivers may notice that their child kind of shifts into a childlike state once the self injury and the emotional distress have been revealed or made apparent, and they're going to need nurturing in that childlike state. This demonstrates to them how they can take care of themselves so that they won't always need you to be the one to do that, especially if they're not always willing to share or open up with you when they are going through something. So if you can model care to them, it teaches them self care as well. Focus on their feeling instead of on the self injury. So, again, if you just take their implements away, the things that they're using, but that feeling that they're sitting with isn't gone, they're just going to internalize the feeling or they're going to sit with it. Taking away the tools that they are using only solves the problem of using self injury to cope. It does not take away the emotion that they are trying to cope with. When you do focus on the injury, it should be on helping them to take care of themselves, like cleaning and disinfecting, bandaging, scar cream. Learn basic first aid if you don't know it, and teach them too. If your child has hurt themselves severely, that is a time for you to focus on the injury and get them appropriate help. If that happens, that is a really important distinction to make. I'm not suggesting that you just ignore the fact that they're hurting themselves, but if you can shift that towards the connection and the self care and showing them that you care about their well being, then do that. And if there is a time when you're actually facing something really severe or serious and you know that they need medical attention, then of course, shift your focus to the injury in that moment. Demonstrate emotional regulation skills to them. Talk to them about things that maybe you have dealt with before. You don't have to get necessarily deeply personal about it, but letting them know that you know what it's like to feel helpless or hopeless, or drawing from experiences where you've been depressed or anxious, and sharing with them some of the ways that you've regulated those emotions, expanding their toolkit of coping strategies so that they can lean more and more towards healthy coping strategies and away from unhealthy coping strategies. And learn what helps to distract them. Now, distractions and coping strategies and things like that are shorter term solutions that have more to do with, again, addressing the self injury itself. And they are not necessarily the longer term solutions that should also be put in place, such as getting them connection to a mental health professional. However, if you learn what distracts them or what helps them to cope, and you can be a part of that, then again, this works to model things to them and also to focus on your connection and let them know that you are very much here and willing to be a part of their healing process. So, for example, do baths help calm them down? And you could run one for them when you notice that they're stressed. Can you allow them to keep their headphones in and listen to music if it's clear they're not regulating very well, instead of asking them to take their headphones out and talk to you? Can you go for a walk with them and just notice nature together, or allow for silence until they can open up? If you can be a part of those strategies for them, then that's amazing. And if they need a little bit of time before they'll allow anybody else into the coping, then that's okay too. And your role can just be to make sure that they know what's available, and that if they need help to get something that they would require to be able to cope, you can get that for them and then leave them to it. It all depends on what they're comfortable with, what you're comfortable with, and again, being really open and honest and communicating with each other so that you're on the same page.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you found it helpful and that it gave you some more insight into what self-injury is and why somebody might be using it to cope. Remember that your relationship and connection with the person in your life who may be self-injuring is one of the most important things that you can focus on and use to help them. And any additional help to deal with, for example, whatever it is that is going on that is creating that need to cope, that is something that they very likely would benefit from talking to a professional about. So if you need to know a little bit more about Open Doors, our services, and what we offer, you can check out our website. You can call us at the number provided on the screen, or you can send us an email as well with the email address provided on the screen.